Today on Spiritual Awakening Radio, Reincarnation in Gnosticism. Let the Gnostics be Gnostic. Reincarnation in Gnosticism according to the Gnostics. This first passage comes from a collection of ancient Gnostic writings known as Pista, Sophia, the Books of the Savior. Reincarnation in Pista, Sophia. Of the incarnation of John the Baptist, that John was Elijah in a former birth, Jesus says, "And when I knew that you had not understood that I had discoursed with you concerning the soul of Elijah, which is bound into John the Baptist, I answered you in the discourse in openness, face to face. If you like to accept John the Baptist, he is Elijah, of whom I had said that he will come," unquote. Reincarnation in the secret book of John, also known as the Apocryphon of John, one of the books of the Nag Hammadi Library discovery. When they came forth from the body, such a soul is given over to the powers created by the rulers, bound in chains and cast into prison again. Around and around it goes until it, the soul, manages to become free from forgetfulness through knowledge or gnosis. And so eventually it becomes perfected and is saved. Reincarnation in the Book of Thomas the Spiritual Athlete, also known as the Book of Thomas the Contender, from the Nag Hammadi Library, one of the Gnostic Gospels. In it, the Savior tells us that after death, those who were once believers but have remained attached to things of transitory beauty will be consumed in their concern about life and will be brought back to the visible realm. At the end of the book of Thomas, the Spiritual Athlete, Jesus says, quote, "Watch and pray that you may not be born in the flesh, but that you may leave the bitter bondage of this life." In other words, pray that you are not reborn on earth, but that you return to higher realms, unquote. There is a website that has a nice large collection of reincarnation passages from Christianity, including from Gnostic sources, reluctantmessenger.com. If you're listening to this Spiritual Awakening Radio podcast by way of YouTube, scroll down to the notes section below for a link to Christian reincarnation, including Gnostic sources. If you're listening to this podcast through other venues or apps, feel free to send me an email and ask for the link to Christian reincarnation, including Gnostic sources. My email address is james@spiritualawakeningradio.com. Note, though the classic Gnostics of antiquity, as we've seen here, believed that reincarnation was part of the human condition, was part of the journey of the soul, was a reality, like Pythagoreanism, Platonism, and Kabbalah or Jewish mysticism. Their goal was to be liberated from it and return back to the true spiritual realm, referred to as the pleroma or fullness. So they believed in reincarnation, but their goal was to stop doing it and to go back to the higher heavens instead of continuing with life after life here on earth or elsewhere in the physical realm. Pista Sophia, that same Gnostic text describing the fall of Sophia, is expounding upon an already established understanding that was articulated in the New Testament by Jesus about John the Baptist being the return of Elijah in Matthew chapter 11, verse 14. Of course, John the Baptist is described as having exited the womb, same as us all, same as everybody else. He was born physically. In other words, an example of reincarnation. As opposed to resurrection, hanging out in a cave secretly for a few centuries and emerging again with a new name, John the Baptist, instead of Elijah, or beaming down from above. He came from the womb. He incarnated into the world again. As for Thomas the spiritual athlete and the Apocryphon of John, those texts are straight out of the Nag Hammadi Library of Egypt. The Secret Book of John, or Apocryphon of John, a kind of sequel to the Gospel of John, is considered to be one of the greatest of Gnostic texts, with multiple copies of it being discovered, a couple different ones in the Nag Hammadi Library discovery, and elsewhere in other discoveries, an indication of popularity and wide usage, and most definitely essential reading for those curious about the real Gnostics of antiquity. The Apocryphon of John includes reincarnation, and that's not surprising, really, given the obvious influences upon Gnosticism, such as Platonism and especially the teachings of Pythagoras, who believed in his own past lives, believed in reincarnation. My approach with this topic is coming from a different place than some out there in the world of podcasting. Mystics may have a sense of their own past lives as something real. Others have beliefs, absent any perception, personal, inner revelation, or insight. Countless are the belief systems. Everybody's got one. Reincarnation is not my passion. After all, the goal of Gnosticism and the enlightened is to not remain on the wheel of transmigration anyway. The goal is to not do it, to not reincarnate. Empirically, objectively proving reincarnation scientifically, or the existence of the soul for that matter, is still in its infancy, however. I have high hopes for both, but it may be a very long wait. One might have to wait for it, reincarnate, before that quantum spirit scope gets invented and someone can start taking measurements. My take is simply to see clearly something far less complicated, far less subtle than the activities of souls in other realms or the beyond. It is to let the Gnostics be Gnostic, treating them equally like any other world religion, and understand just what exactly the original spiritual movements labeled Gnostic actually taught, based on what they themselves have to say about that, and not what other esoteric groups coming into being many centuries or millennia later presume that the Gnostics taught, cooking in their own particular theological and cultural cauldron of bias, somewhere in Europe or the U.S., far removed from the Mediterranean of the ancient world where the Gnostics once existed. The Saga of the Gnostics. Athanasius forbids the reading of their scriptures. Constantine and his allies attempt to eliminate them from the planet. Gleeful bishops in Egypt engaged in Gnostic cleansing, driving Gnostics out of villages. Irenaeus slanders them in his writings for centuries to come, kicking at the dust of the bones of the Gnostics. Most forget about them, which is quite poetic in this world of forgetfulness. Others call themselves Gnostic, usurp, impersonate, and then redefine what they call Gnostic. The ultimate indignity. I wouldn't be surprised if some esoteric group that has branded itself as Gnostic has some sort of Gnostic cookbook with meat recipes in it. The various Gnostic groups of antiquity were all vegetarians. And so when you see that, and I've had examples of that. I've seen examples of Gnostic groups calling themselves Gnostic in the modern world with no direct connection to ancient Gnosticism. So therefore, neo-Gnostic would be a more accurate term. They've advocated eating meat and are anti-veg even. And yet the real Gnostics of antiquity were all vegetarians. So it just shows how out of touch they are. What else are they out of touch about when it comes to the subject of Gnosticism? Gnostic is such an abused word. Let the Gnostics define their own beliefs. So as I view the saga of the Gnostics, the treatment of the true classic Gnostics of antiquity, the only solution is to let the Gnostics be Gnostic, truly hear their voice embedded in the surviving texts that have come directly from them, and allow them to speak for themselves, define their own beliefs, diet, and spiritual practices. Then others may benefit from their wisdom. And in that sense, Gnosticism as a spiritual path can potentially reincarnate into the world again, or far more likely, help someone to recognize those who already seem to be following something equivalent to a living gnosis now in the modern age. Spiritual seekers, if they have an understanding of ancient Gnosticism and it appeals to them as a spiritual path, if they see clearly those teachings, they may recognize a living Gnostic path in the world today and decide to follow that, a living gnosis now. Thanks for joining me today for Spiritual Awakening Radio, focused on reincarnation in Gnosticism and letting the Gnostics be Gnostic. My email address is james@spiritualawakeningradio.com if you'd like to receive that link to a whole collection of references to reincarnation in Christian and including Gnostic texts of antiquity. James@spiritualawakeningradio.com, or you can send me a text message at this number, 508-603-9381. See you again very soon for another edition of Spiritual Awakening Radio.